It was not long after the start of the post-World War II stage that the next great ideological conflict began: the Cold War, the global battle between capitalism and socialism. In this battle, numerous coup attempts, misinformation campaigns, and proxy wars came into effect, with the US seeking to follow through on the policy of containment, working tirelessly to sabotage, weaken, and ultimately crush the emerging global socialist movement. The Vietnam War is no exception, with this particular war highlighting how hot the supposedly Cold War really was. After World War II, a wave of decolonization began to emerge within much of the Third World, essentially meaning that a number of countries that were victims of colonialism and imperialism, whether it be under the French, the Japanese, or the Americans, were fighting for their own independence and autonomy. Vietnam had for decades been under the thumb of French colonialism, and the Vietnam War can be rooted in the anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, nationalist, and later socialist struggle of Vietnam against France. It was this uprising against the French colonial powers that served as the catalyst for US involvement in Vietnam. After nearly 10 years of Vietnam's struggle against France, the revolutionary nationalist Viet Minh, under the guidance of one Ho Chi Minh, reached a watershed moment when the revolutionary forces obtained victory at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. For a brief time, Vietnam had defeated colonialism in its region. However, it was soon after the victory at Dien Bien Phu that Vietnam saw itself divided along the 17th parallel as a result of the Geneva Peace Conference, similar to the division of Korea in the immediate aftermath of World War II only a handful of years earlier. A unification election under the watch of the UN, the United Nations, was supposed to happen, but the United States, brandishing its Truman Doctrine and policy of containment, blocked said elections from happening in the fear that Vietnam would unify as a socialist state. Further paralleling the division of Korea, the US propped up and supported one Ngo Dinh Diem, an anti-communist, as leader of the southern half of Vietnam. Diem would then launch an attack on South Vietnamese people who supported the North, derogatorily referring to them as the Viet Cong. The United States didn't really get its feet wet in the war until 1964 as a result of two things: the political instability in South Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, along with a supposed attack on the USS Maddox on August 4th of 1964, pushed the United States to become more hands-on with the war, passing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that effectively gave President Lyndon Baines Johnson the power to get as involved in the war as he pleased, leading ultimately to far more death and destruction in this proxy war. This resolution was built on a lie, as records later showed that while a very minor attempt at an attack on the USS Maddox happened on August 2nd, there was no such attack on August 4th, the one that in particular was used by officials to further instigate and perpetuate the Vietnam War. At a certain point near the end of his presidency, LBJ began to seek a way out of the highly unpopular Vietnam War, slightly scaling back US aid. When Richard Nixon ascended to presidency, he did, to be frank, a complete 180 and continued to engage with the war efforts. Even as protests calling for the end of the war waged on, some even turning deadly, such as the infamous 1970 Kent State Massacre, where 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen, Nixon aimed to appeal to the so-called silent majority of Americans that supported the US being in Vietnam. Nixon's approach to this war was to reduce the amount of troops on the ground and to increase air attacks and bombings, a method that became known as Vietnamization, as these tactics were at least in some way borrowed from the Vietnamese people. The Nixon administration would go on to carry out similar missions, with the clandestine bombing of Cambodia and Laos without congressional approval being one of the most notorious instances. After the death of nearly 60,000 American troops, 250,000 South Vietnamese troops, approximately 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, and 2 million Vietnamese civilians, the Vietnam War, or at least American involvement in the war, finally reached an endpoint. In 1973, just short of 20 years after the US officially became involved in Vietnam, the Nixon administration essentially strong-armed the Southern government into signing a treaty with the North, threatening to cease Western aid to Vietnam if the war were to continue. This can at least in some form be attributed to the massive onslaught of anti-war demonstrations that this war inspired. As the United States withdrew their forces, North and South Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords in January of that year. Tensions remained in Vietnam, however, and fighting would continue not long after the signing of the peace accords. After an additional 2 years of war, North Vietnam attained victory over the South, reunifying the two Vietnams into one. As of July 2nd, 1976, there has only been one Vietnam, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.